All right, guys, here we go with our second set of ecology notes on populations. So let's dig in here. Um, oops. So got the red one highlighted here. So same slide as you saw on the first set of notes, just kind of moving along here, going into groups of similar organisms. So how are they structured and how are populations affected by the environment? There's only two ways in and two ways out of a population. So you're either born in or you move in, or you die or you move out. So that's really only the two ways that you can get into or out of a population. That's pretty straightforward and just kind of a fact, is what it is. Some of this you will have seen before, I'm quite certain. So regular bio talked about J curves and some other things as well that you're going to see today. So exponential growth model, so things growing exponentially, where the growth rate just really jumps up there super fast, like this guy right here. So not very many organisms, and then once you get a few and they have no limiting factors, and they have all the resources they need, then the populations tend to just skyrocket, right? Insects do this every year. Mosquitoes, right? They ramp up really, really high, and then first frost comes and they drop. And then next year, same thing. So repetitive J curves for things like insects and bacteria. Um, and it says, although at some point all populations grew exponentially, it's kind of a neat graph down here. This is elephants. Elephants look like this at some point. If you look back through the history, they actually did this back in the early 1900s, where they really hit a peak. So kind of interesting to think that an organism like that would follow that kind of curve, but just for a while. Not everything, they don't stay that way. So here's a little bit more on the exponential growth model. So it can be described by change in number of individuals, dn, over change in time. You might start noticing some math terms here, and you wouldn't be wrong. We're going to be doing a little bit of math here in a minute and kind of showing you how some of these rates are figured out, and some of these formulas are figured out to predict population growth. So R is the per capita rate of increase, so R is for rate. How many offspring per individual in the population. So if R is positive, the population is going to be growing. If R is negative, the population is going to be shrinking. And if R is 0, as you might expect, the population is going to be holding still. So that's kind of the basics for now. We're going to get into some more stuff here in a minute. But you can see for the rate being 1.0, that's a much steeper curve than it is if it's half, right? So it took almost double the time, if the rate is half versus the rate is 1 to reach that peak there. So if we keep going, we're going to look at the logistic growth model, okay? And the logistic growth model you should associate with the S curve for extremely obvious reasons, right? It looks like kind of a lazy S here, okay? And if you'll notice, the first part still looks like the J, right? There's a lot of growth here, and then it hits this dotted line and it levels off, right? And so the dotted line is indicating this, the carrying capacity. So that is the amount of organisms that a ecosystem can support, assuming the limitations, if there are any. So the symbol is K, okay? The symbol for carrying capacity is K, not C. And so this is the carrying capacity, and it's pretty constant, this dotted line across there. Most populations follow this model. Here's a paramecium, little diagram down here, shows you the S curve. And we'll kind of be talking back and forth about the exponential versus logistic growth models, right? But basically, the J curve, the exponential one's not going to have a lot of limitations. They're going to have all the resources they need. There's no limiting factors. With these, there's going to be limiting factors. Something is not allowing this population to keep growing up like that. Maybe it's a lack of food. Maybe it's a lack of mates. Whatever it may be, some sort of factor is limiting this population, right? I mean, this one in particular is on yeast cells, so would have to have something to do with probably nutrients or space or something like that. So if we look here, this is one of the formulas that you're going to see on your AP Bio formula sheet for the AP exam. And it looks super complicated, right? This thing looks really crazy right here. This thing looks really crazy, but it's not too bad. This is just talking about the change in the number. N is the number of organisms, and K is your carrying capacity. And notice there's two Ks here, there's two N's here, so you're plugging in a lot of the same numbers over and over. And again, this is just kind of your rate, right? Your dN dt is going to be your rate. And so, or the change in the individuals over time, right? Which basically rate. So if we do a couple practice problems here, let me show you how this really can go. So let me switch over to where you can see a couple things that I'm doing. So let me write this down so that we can see it on the sheet. Okay. So here is the formula that we were just looking at. So I'm going to have you do a couple practice problems. So I'd like you to get a piece of pen and paper out and try and do a couple of these. Here's what I'm going to show you. In the first scenario, K is 1,000, N is 900, and the rate is 0.1. So this is our carrying capacity, 1,000 organisms. Our number is at 900. That's the number of organisms currently, and our rate is 0.01. So what does that mean, right? So if we put this in, dN over dt. So R is our rate, so here's our 0.1. And the next one is the number, which for our scenario is going to be 900, right? And that's all going to be times by K minus N, 1,000 minus 900, all over K. Okay? So if you do this math, if you work this all out, you're going to come up with the answer is 9. Okay? And there's really no unit. This is just a value. This is just kind of used for comparison. Okay? So that's kind of how you do that. So let me show you another one real quick. So what if we did K is 1,000, N is 500, and R is, again, 0.1. Okay, so if you look at these first two, the only number I changed is the number of things we're starting with. Carrying capacity is still 1,000. We had 900. Our number ended up being 9. So what I want you to do is I want you to draw an arrow right now on your piece of paper. Do you think the number we're going to get for this problem is going to go up? Do you think it's going to go down? Or do you think it's going to be the same? Okay. Will the number be bigger, smaller, or the same when we do this problem? So pause the video for a minute, work out the math, and then we'll see. Go ahead, pause it, do it. All right, hopefully you did that. I'm not going to plug in, so all these numbers are just going to plug in, right? This is the only number that's going to change. 500 here, 500 there. And if you work that out, your answer should have come out to 25. If you don't believe me, check it out. Feel free to check me. So now our number went up. Hopefully you chose the up arrow. And the reason for that is because we started with 900 and the carrying capacity is 1,000. There's not a lot of room for growth there. There's more room for growth, right? 500 to 1,000. So much more room for growth, so your value goes up. So let's try this again to make sure you guys get this. Okay, same thing. Do up arrow, down arrow, or stays put. Make your prediction now. Look at what you got. And again, I'm only changing the one number. from 900 to 500 to 1,000. I mean to 100, my fault. 900, 500, 100. So plug all your numbers in. Okay, really it's the same as this right here, except we're plugging in 100 here and 100 here. And pause the video, work it out, see what you get. And this one may have tricked you a little bit, because the answer is also 9. If you work the math out, the answer is also 9, and you should have chose the down arrow. You might say, well, why? There's so much room for growth. I thought it would have been like 50 or 75 or some, much bigger number. Why did it go back down? Well, in some cases, the number gets too small to have really rapid population growth. When you think about, the graph, they start out down here for a long time and they don't really get going until there's enough organisms to really make it work. So we were probably just stuck down in this area somewhere before that would go. Eventually, that would probably work up there, but we're probably just stuck down there in the lower section. For some reason, there's not enough resources or numbers to make that go. Okay, so kind of an interesting thing, but that formula is not that scary, right? Like it looks like a big scary formula, the one up here, and that'll be on your formula sheet, and they actually tell you what most of the variables even mean. So I think you should be able to handle problems like that without too much issue. Okay, so let's do this. Let's go back to here, and let's continue. So this one I'm going to go through super fast because it's not actually an AP thing, but mark and recapture is pretty cool. So I am going to talk through it kind of fast, but because it's nothing that is really going to show up on the AP exam, but it's pretty interesting. So I thought you guys might think it's cool. It's really hard to count organisms, right? It's super hard to count ants, and like in a caribou migration where there's 100,000 of them, like all this stuff is super hard to count. Fish is crazy hard to count, right? You don't even know how many are in a pond or in a lake. So the way they do this is a method called mark and recapture. So you catch a small sample, so you go fishing basically. You catch a small sample of the fish, you mark them, so we mark one of them, or sorry, we mark all 3 of them and we throw them back, right? So now the 3 with the green dots are back into the lake, they're back into the population. A few days later, you come back and you go fishing again. And you catch 4 fish this time, and this time 1 of the 4 is marked. These are just hypotheticals, obviously. And so the way you would do this, I'm sorry, that looks a little weird. In fact, I think there might be, yeah, this is better. So the way you do this, and it is just an estimation of population. You take the number first marked, which was 3, you multiply it by the total number of animals in the second catch, which was 4, so that gives you 12, and you divide it by the number of marked animals in the second catch. And so that would give us 12. And if you go back, and I think if you look at this, I think it's however many fish we started with. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. We estimated 12. There were actually 15 in our fake pond. So were we totally correct? No. Were we in the neighborhood? Yeah, probably. Okay. So here's a little practice problem for you as well. Which pond will give you the best opportunity to catch the most fish? So it says caught and marked 15 fish on A, released them, later caught 18 and 3 were marked on the right side. You caught and marked 19, you released them, you later caught 29 fish and 3 were marked. So Pond A has a total of 90 fish and Pond B has a total of 183. But the problem is the density for Pond B is much lower, right? So if we did the number of fish per gallon, then it's actually Pond A that you'd have better luck in. You'd find more fish in A density-wise. So a little bit about mark and recapture, but it's a pretty cool little system. Moving on to a few more terms here, distribution. So usually in 3 patterns, clumped, uniform, and random. Pretty self-explanatory by the pictures. Some of them are in clumps. Some of them are uniformly distributed, meaning they all have about equal space, and others are random. So not anything too tricky there. Demographics, so moving into some demographic stuff where we look at life tables and reproductive tables, survivorship curves. Basically, you're studying the population's vital statistics and how they change. So birth rates, death rates, growth rates, all that sort of stuff. In this case, there's three types of curves here: type 1, type 2, and type 3. These are called survivorship curves. So type 1 individuals are these, where, keep in mind, down here, here's a timeline. Young here, time goes by, old down here, okay? So the more you move to the right, the older the organisms are. So in these, when they're young, they live pretty good. They live pretty good. They live pretty good. And then as they get old, the death rate kicks in. Okay, most individuals die late in life in type 1. Type 2, doesn't really matter how old you are. It's a pretty uniform rate of decline. Whether you're old, young, or middle-aged, they just kind of die at the same rate. That's type 2. And then type 3, huge decline in the young. So you see this in like insects and stuff like that, where, oh gosh, didn't know the pen was still on. A lot of the young die really early, or things that, maybe like fish that lay a bunch of eggs, they would probably have a lot of young die. But then if they make it past a certain point, then they actually last a little bit better, and they finally, not very many of them actually get old. Okay. Couple more things about some terms here. Life history traits, combination of factors that affect an organism's life table, meaning their reproductive strategies, physiological or behavioral features that can affect their length of life, their habitat, how competitive they are. So, the things that give them advantages. Reproductive strategies, just a couple terms here: semal-parity, iteroparity. A lot of offspring at one time. This is kind of like our agave tree over here. So here's our agave tree. Notice birth, death, and just before death, there's a red dot. Well, that red dot means it's a reproductive event. So they live their whole lives not really reproducing. Now they have a bunch of offspring, and then they die really late in life. So this will be a lot of offspring all at one time, which is very different than having a few offspring repeatedly, right? So, and lots of organisms just have a few offspring each year, every other year, stuff like that. Parental care. We talked about parental care a little bit already. This kind of shows you a little bit more on that in an example here. Parents surviving the following winter of having their broods, right? Because when they have their babies, that takes a toll on mom and dad. And so here's an enlarged brood size, here's a normal brood size, here's reduced brood size. Well, what do you think? What's really going on here with the percent surviving of mom and dad? The females always survive slightly better than the males. Not surprising. Girls are just tougher. Then you have a enlarged, normal, and reduced. And here are your tallest bars, right? So if it's a smaller brood size, meaning they had less babies, then the parents tend to make it through the winter a little bit better the next winter, because they didn't have to stress out so much and go find food for so many little offspring. So kind of makes sense. Kind of makes sense. They're spending a lot of time on parental care. It takes a toll. R selected versus K selected. So R selected, these are the ones with a rate strategy. Organisms with a high rate per capita population growth, but poor competitive ability, right? So your insects, your things that reproduce very quickly in massive numbers, but can't really compete very well. A lot of those numbers won't actually make it. They just have a big birth rate, but they also have a high death rate. So things that are small in size, grow rapidly, short lifespan, a lot of small seeds are going to be in that category. K selected, the K is for the carrying capacity. These are the ones that are going to kind of be more long-term, more stable, and they're going to be able to adapt a little bit better and be able to exist a little closer to the carrying capacity. It's not so violent, right? The other ones are kind of like, oh, we're doing well, crash. Oh, we're doing well, crash. This one's just kind of going up, and then they kind of maintain, and they go down a little bit, and they go up a little bit, and they go down a little bit, but they're pretty much maintaining that number toward the top. So things that have larger size, slower growth, longer lifespans, so big old oak trees would be better than like these dandelions and weeds down here, okay? And you can probably think of what animals would be that way, right? Top one, things like, mosquitoes and insects. Bottom one, things like, elephants and hippos and, most big mammals, things like that. Here's a table between R and K selected. It's actually from an old textbook, but you can read through here. R versus K, development, rapid versus slow, reproductive rate, high versus low, reproductive age, early versus late. So these all kind of, I think, are pretty self-explanatory. You're welcome to pause video and read through that. Low parental care for the ones that just keep reproducing as fast as they can. They're just doing it by volume, right? But K selected, you might only have one offspring, so you need to care for that baby elephant as much as possible to make sure it survives. Lots of parental care. More terms you should have seen in regular bio: density dependent and density independent factors. So dependent is when the mortality rate varies according to population density, and then density independent when the mortality rate is not affected by changes in density. So density dependent are things like disease, COVID, right? Getting passed in cities more than Montana because of how close everything is in proximity. The density is more. So, a disease or something that can get passed between people is going to be much worse in a population dense area than it is in an area that's not dense. So it's a factor that depends on the density. Density independent factor, when it doesn't matter, that's when it's a hurricane. That's when it's a forest fire or a flood. It doesn't matter. It's a natural disaster. Whether there's 4 or 40 or 400, it's taking them out, right? Doesn't matter. Inverse density dependent factor. This is when mortality decreases as a population density increases. Kind of weird to think about. Process that for a minute. Mortality decreases as population density increases. Seems kind of backwards, but this is how it might look. Okay, so here's your density here's your population density. So as the density increases, so does mortality. Okay, density independent factor does not matter. Doesn't matter how many things there are, the rate of mortality is all going to be the same. Inverse density dependent factors, as there is more things, the mortality rate actually goes down. And a good example for this is lions and wildebeest. So a lion is gonna take a wildebeest, right, for food. Let's call it once a week. They take down one wildebeest a week for their food. Do you think lions are gonna all of a sudden start taking down 4 or 5? They can't actually eat that much in a week. So they just steadily take the same number of wildebeest, let's say one a week. So if the wildebeest population starts going and they start reproducing more, and maybe they merge with another herd and the population gets bigger, but the lion's still taking his one a week, then actually the rate would go down, right? Because there's more wildebeest and the same amount of death. So that's why the lion actually dips down. This is always a good one. The snowshoe hare and the lynx. You can track what's going on here. So you have the snowshoe hare is the blue line, lynx is the red line. So when you look, you see the snowshoe hare going up, and then not far behind it, so does the lynx population. And so as the lynx population increases, what happens to the snowshoe hare population? It comes down. And then what happens to the lynx population? It also comes down. Okay, so they are mirroring each other, right? They are in a symbiotic relationship, this predator-prey relationship, and they just kind of, the population sizes and rates just kind of fluctuate and follow each other because they're so tied together. Examples of density dependent factors, I mentioned that a second ago: competition, predation, disease, intrinsic factors. The intrinsic factors, don't worry about a whole lot. These are very specific factors that apply to specific species. So for one species, it might be how many offspring they have. For another, it might have to do with like a temperature. Like it's really specific things to specific species. But I think density dependent, this probably makes sense to you. Moving into some human stuff here. Human population growth. Kind of interesting that the underlying problem of all anthropogenic ecological problems on Earth are because of human population growth. Basically, we're the cause of kind of all of the problems. The growth rate of humans has been exponential since the Industrial Revolution. So here's a little dip right here, and that was because of the bubonic plague. Okay, and then since this moment, here's the Industrial Revolution, and the population has just gone crazy exponential, right? That's quite the J curve. That's pretty steep in not that much time. Okay, so here's year 2100. So, at some point they think it will level off. It's going to have to, right? Because we're going to hit the carrying capacity of the planet. I'll show you a few numbers here in a minute. Decrease in growth around the world is not uniform, so we use these things called age structure diagrams. If you look in West Africa or you look in Western Europe, these things are going to look very different. And the way you read these, percent of population, and the zero's in the middle, okay? So then it goes from 0 to 10 this way, and this is for the males. And then it goes from 0 to 10 this way, and this is for the females. And here is the age. So 0 to 4, this is how, this red bar right here, that's how many females there are from age 0 to 4. Here's the 0 to 4 males, is in the bottom bar there. And you can look at each age group and notice that the vast majority of the population in Western Africa is like mid-20s and lower. So what's going to happen to their population down the road? This is like a massive indicator that there's going to be a lot of growth, right? Massive growth in West Africa because everybody's coming up to reproductive age and they're going to start having more babies. If you look over here in Western Europe, here's your males, here's your females, okay? The bulge of the baby boomers. So my parents are in that group where they're starting to get older. Actually, my parents are in an upper, they're a little bit of, in front of the baby boomers now. So you have your male, your female, you have your percent of population on the bottom again, and then here's your age groups. Well, notice there's not very many young people in Western Europe. The vast majority of their people are in their 30s and 40s, which for most people is past reproductive age. And this bulge right here is going to start going up, and it's going to get more top heavy, right? Eventually, this is all going to be up here, and then it's going to be skinny down here. And so you're really going to have negative growth. You're not going to have any growth at all, okay? Kind of interesting, this one right here, death of men due to World War II. Like you can see how the block is much shorter on the men's side than the women's side because of how many died during World War II. Demographic transition. So this is talking about countries that are less industrialized versus the industrialized countries. So this one over here, infant mortality, deaths per 1,000 births. So industrialized countries, the infant mortality rate per 1,000, we're sitting at like, what is that, 6 or 7 babies per 1,000 in industrialized countries. But look at this, it's over 50 babies are going to die in less industrialized countries. Okay, and here's one for life expectancy. Industrialized, we're pushing 80, 75, getting up there. Less industrialized, they're like 10 years behind. They're sitting there like 65 instead of 75 or 77. So kind of shows you a few things. And this is how areas really transition. So at the beginning, you have high birth rates and high death rates. Okay, that's stage one. You have high birth rates and high death rates. And then as you get more established and the population gets a little bit older, the death rate decreases. So it comes down quite a bit. And this is the transition period right here. And then as your death rate comes down, well, the people getting older, they're still having some babies here, high birth rate, but then they start to fall off, right? They start getting a little bit older, the birth rate decreases. So the birth rate comes back down, the death rate stays down because you don't have real young ones anymore. And then the low birth and low death rate um, are going to stay low for at least a little while. Okay. Another interesting one, average number of children born to a woman in her lifetime. Notice this slide was probably from the early 2000s, so it's a little bit out of date, but pretty interesting to look and see. Like from 1950 to 1955, in North America, each family was having about 3.5 kids. Now we're down to 2, or at least in 2003 we were. But look at the numbers, like everybody was high way back then, and the amount of children that were being born, the rate was much higher than it is now. Every single area has dropped between the 1950s and the 2000s, right? This was right after World War II, right? So this is part of what caused the baby boom. Everybody came home from war and started having some babies. Problem is now we're looking at a world at the Earth and how much human population there is, and it's pretty crazy to think about. We're already here. Here's 2021 right in here, right? And it kind of depends on what the rate is going to be, but I believe we are just under the 8 million or 8 billion amount of people on the planet. I think we're about in there. I'll look in 1 second. So it depends on the rate. If we have a low population rate, we can curtail this and hopefully make it come down. Problem is we're already up here. Okay. So to get it back down a little bit, we'd have to, really have a low rate. This TFR is total fertility rate. If we have the medium growth, then in 2050, by the way, 2050 is in your lifetime for sure. Okay. You guys are, 17, 18, something like that. 2050 is basically 30 years from now. You're looking at 9 billion. You know what the global population was when I was in middle school? It was about 4. It was right about 4 billion. I remember this very vividly. So we're about at 8, and we've doubled in my lifetime. Double the amount of people on the planet in my lifetime. And while I am old, I am not that old. Okay? So think about if we're at 8 now and we double in your lifetime, we're going to blow this number out of the water. You guys are going to be up here. This is why the whole issue with planet resources and taking care of the planet is so huge, because whether we want to or not, we're going to figure out what the carrying capacity of the planet is. Okay, that's kind of the unofficial experiment that's going on right now. We keep growing like this, and we need food, but we keep building subdivisions on all the farms. What are we going to do? Okay, you can't. It's not real healthy just to eat manufactured Cheetos the whole time. So this is why people are so adamant about trying to help the planet. So this one's kind of interesting, the ecological footprint. This means like how much energy and resources each country is using. I think it says an actual ecological footprint per person. So hectares, the HA is a hectare per person. So look who's leading the way. So basically, we use more energy and resources per person in our country than everybody else. Here's the world average. Okay, here's the world average, and it's down there just below 3, and we're up above 10. So let's call it 3 times more than the world average is the energy and resources that people in America use. Australia behind us, Canada, Germany, UK. I mean, even these are very developed and advanced countries right here. Germany, UK, and Japan. Those are very advanced countries and very developed countries, and they're at hanging around 5. But nope, we're way up here. Okay, so that's why people are trying to come up with ways to solve this problem. So it's affecting climate change. It's affecting our food supply, all sorts of stuff. And it's why there's a lot of jobs in environmental science right now. If any of you took environmental science in high school or are thinking about majoring in it in college, you'll probably get a job because people got to figure these problems out. Because if we're all left to our own devices here, we're probably going to use up all the resources at some point. And, you know, while it may be okay for you, it's not going to be okay for your kids or your grandkids. Things are changing too rapidly for that. So anyway, kind of some scary numbers to look at, but that's the way it's going. So that is the last slide. So hope you guys got a little something out of that, and I'll be seeing you soon.